Hey, howdy here. Screencast on suicide. Right, we'll learn and focus different sociological explanations of suicide, similarities between these different approaches, and the analysis and evaluation we derive from these using sociological theory. There's your keywords and terms that you need to know. Those two, you need to understand what they are, and then those four types, find out what they are through this video and what they mean. The first thing we're going to look at this week is the idea of positivist Durkheim theories and stuff like that. Durkheim believed that suicide had social causes. By looking at it from a social causal viewpoint, it helped validate sociology in its early days as a method of explaining things, and Durkheim hoped to use looking at suicide as a way of sociology to be a science. He argued that previous factors were inadequate in explaining why suicide happened. So although he acknowledges that some people are more predisposed to say depression and things like that and reasons to commit suicide, psychology fails to look at why masses of society commit suicide. They can't all suffer from those predisposed things that impact on whether or not they're going to take their own lives. So Durkheim believed that there was different social factors that were evidenced within the structure of society, and he found four main patterns. First of all, that the rates of any given society remain pretty constant and the same throughout time. When any changes did coincide, they were normally because of other factors such as war, times of austerity or prosperity. And there were different societies had different rates, so it wasn't always just because of the time. It might be because of where you are, so there's societal and situational differences. And that rates vary between different social groups of a given society. So within those different societies, if you break it down even further, there's differences. So Catholics have a lower suicide rate than Protestants. People who live in rural communities have lower than if they live in cities. People who are widowed or divorced or not tied with children have higher suicide than those who do have dependents. This all comes from quantitative data that Durkheim collected during the 19th century. And Durkheim believed that based on all this, there was evidence that suicide can't just be down to individual motivation, and as such, it's a sociological explanation that needs to be brought forward rather than a psychological reason. When we look at the social factors and the types of suicide, Durkheim believes there's two key social factors, and that the idea of social integration and the sense that you belong to a group and have an obligation to a group. So this could be a religious group, this could be a societal group, this could be a country, and the more that we are integrated within these social groups, the lower the suicide rate will be. And then there's the moral regulation. This is how society regulates our acts, our norms, our values, and by being kept in check by these regulations, then believes that suicide is lower in certain instances. Durkheim believed that without regulation, the desires to achieve things become infinite, and we can't satisfy them, and that puts it at a higher risk of committing suicide. So it is important to have regulation to a certain level in the eyes of Durkheim. Four types of suicide that Durkheim has theorized. The first one is egotistic, and this is the most common form of or reason for suicide. And this is because we have too little integration. And this comes from a more modern society that we live in, where we're more individual and we are shut off from the outside world and shut off from society. It could help explain the difference in rates between Catholics and Protestants, because Catholics are more integrated in beliefs and rituals, whereas Protestants aren't as ritualistic as Catholics. So there's that idea that we are an individual, where if we look at Catholics, they see more of a belonging and togetherness, not as an individual. Interestingly, this is less common in wartime, and this could be because we have a common purpose and a common goal, and the idea of pulling together for one good outcome. The opposite of egotistic is altruistic, and this is where we have too much integration. This idea of like a duty to die, and we put others before ourselves and self-sacrifice. A couple of examples of this could be Japanese kamikaze pilots during the Second World War, who were willing to fly their planes into targets for the good of the cause, and their altruism comes for the sacrifice of their land and their army. Hindu widows perform an act called sati, which is where they throw themselves on the funeral pyre of their husbands. And this is because they don't want to become a burden on the family. And Inuits do this as well, where if if their partner dies, they walk off into the wilderness and basically freeze to death. So altruism is the opposite of egotistic, in that we are doing it for the good of someone else. Then we've got anomic, which is based on the idea of anomy, where there's too little moral regulation, and where norms are unclear or even become obsolete. A couple of examples of this could be, say, like a boom or bust economy. So a booming economy, a sudden booming economy, could lead to unachievable social expectations. And because we can't achieve these social expectations quickly, that could lead people to committing suicide because they are failing to achieve their objectives. In a bust economy, so the Wall Street crash, etc., of 1929, I think the idea of suicide is pretty obvious, in that we had these social expectations and they've been completely taken away from us because we've lost money, we've lost our jobs, we might have lost our home, and people are so unclear about what is right and what's wrong in society that they can't handle it, and as a result commit suicide. The opposite of that is fatalistic, in that there's too much moral regulation, and the idea of, well, there's nothing I can do about it, and you feel restricted, and you feel a bit like a prisoner. You might actually feel like a prisoner, you might be a prisoner. So slaves and prisoners are most likely to commit fatalistic suicide, because they are regulated so much. You're told what to do, when to do it, how long to do it, how to do it, and they're punished if they don't actually meet that. And as a result, slaves and prisoners are very likely to commit that type of suicide. So, as I said before a little bit, the type of society we live in has a major impact. So if we look at a modern and traditional society, so if you think about industrialization as a good barometer of when society changed from modern to traditional, as you can see, in an industrial modern society where there is little integration, a lot about everyone out for themselves, looking out for themselves, or even just the family rather than wider society, and too little regulation, because we have independence and we have freedom of speech and we're able to do things for ourselves, and if we don't like something then we can disagree to do it, then because of that, Durkheim believes we have more anomic and egotistic suicide. Whereas before industrialization came around, there was too much regulation and there was too much altruism and good for society and doing things for society. Maybe we couldn't fulfill our role within society. Different reasons, and this is why there is more fatalist and altruist suicide committed in the eyes of Durkheim. More modern positivist approaches. One comes from Holbach's, which is he was a student of Durkheim and a great advocate for the work that Durkheim had carried out. And a good thing about Holbach's, when we look at it, is that it's because in the 1930s we've got a little bit more reliable statistics and also ways of keeping statistics as well. Holbach's argued that the main difference between urban and rural residents were the main reasons for variations in suicides, and this is backed up by Salisbury as well, and Sainsbury, not Salisbury, who believe that based on where you live has more to do with it than who you are or your predisposition and mental predisposition. So the reason why there might be higher rates among Protestants is because they tend to live in more urban areas, where rural areas have a very strong Catholic community sense, and that's in the eyes of Holbach's is the reason why it's committed. Salisbury found that the reason why London has such a high suicide rate compared to the rest of the country is because of the amount of disorganisation in urban areas. There's higher divorce rates, there's higher rates of single parents and things like that, and that has more to do with the reasons for such high suicide rates. Gibbs and Martin, again, are great advocates of Durkheim's, and they believe that he's probably the foremost sociological theory about in terms of suicide. But they've brought it on a little bit further, and they believe that there's integration through stable and lasting relationships. That's not necessarily sexual relationships or love or anything like that, but it could be down to other things such as employment. So they've come up with this idea of status integration, where more than one status can go hand in hand. There's no conflict between them. An example of this would be someone who has a really high education, degree, master's, PhD or whatever, but they're forced to take a low status job. Then suicide rates would be higher. This could coincide with something like the Wall Street crash in 1929, where you've got people who are on high salaries, really high status jobs, are suddenly having to take menial, lower graded jobs, and they might feel humiliated, or, as Gibbs and Martin say, there's a status integration problem there. A few criticisms of Durkheim would be that it's the statistical thing, really, is that 19th century statistics and the autopsies and the way that they gathered statistics weren't very sophisticated. There was less likelihood to have to gather statistics. So that's the major criticism of Durkheim. But no one really kind of challenges his basic aim, which is that sociology is a scientific way of finding out about suicide, and that if we're looking at it on a grand society wide scale thing, then you can't really look at it from a psychology viewpoint, because that's a very individual as opposed to the wider scheme of things. That's it for now. I'll see you all in class. Bye bye.